dear guests and speakers. My name is Krista Bombera, and I warmly welcome you at one of the afternoon sessions of the closing conference of the Research Facility on Inequalities. This session will present the various tools developed or expanded through the Research Facility on Inequalities, which tools offer a wide array of options for both policymakers and development practitioners to tackle inequalities in their policies and strategies. In this session, we'll have 5 speakers, each of them presenting for about 10 or 15 minutes. After that, we'll have a short coffee break at around 4:30, and then we welcome you all back to hear from our 2 discussants reflecting on the issues presented to us before. A bit after 5 o'clock, we'll have time to answer questions from you, although our team keeps an eye on your questions during the whole session, and I will have a little time after each speaker to ask some of them, even between presentations. So please take advantage of the Slido app available somewhere here to the right on the button of the screen to put your questions and comments there and interact with the speakers. Let us start now by setting the scene by Ms. Anda Davies, a lead economist on inequality at AFD. Let me really shortly introduce her. The current projects of Ms. Davies focus on the impact of emigration on countries of origin, for example, labor market or women's labor, also on inequalities, social cohesion, and aid effectiveness. She also analyzes inequalities and migration patterns and coordinates the scientific aspects of the European Research Facility on Inequalities. Prior to joining AFD's research division, Ms. Davies worked on several collaborations with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the International Labour Organization, and the World Bank. Thank you, Ms. Davies, for setting the scene for our session on tools now.
Thank you so much. I have to say that it's quite challenging to set the scene for such a panel, not only because the brilliant people on it probably have much more things to say about this than I do, but also because it is built on a concept that is quite abstract. Esther Duflo, the Nobel Prize, saw economists as plumbers when they got into the nitty-gritties of policy design and implementation. And it's exactly what this session is all about. How do we support policies, but also development cooperation strategies to effectively tackle inequality? The 2030 Agenda pushed inequalities to the top priorities through the SDG 10, but this doesn't mean that poverty is no longer an issue or that we will stop working or researching on poverty-related topics. Reducing inequalities, it's not just built on ethical grounds, although these should be prevalent, it's also instrumental in order to achieve poverty reduction. But while poverty is an outcome of inequality, there are significant differences between the 2 concepts, which render inequality reduction specifically difficult. First of all, inequality is a phenomenon that has extremely high inertia. It is much more persistent than poverty and even growth. This is partly due to the fact that intergenerational transmission of status is quite persistent. It's very strong, and therefore the asset distribution is also persistent. But also because crucial factors that shape inequalities and thus and poverty and policies, such as the political regimes in place, social norms, and institutions, do not change easily. Secondly, inequality lacks the sort of normative and commonly acknowledged approach that poverty has. A person can be poor, but she cannot be unequal. And inequality is a relative concept with changing boundaries, and there is no universal norm to it. We can aim to eradicate extreme income poverty, even though some researchers say that this is quite a difficult goal to achieve. But we cannot aim for perfect income equality. Today, inequality is in the debates everywhere, sometimes to the disdain of the researchers who have spent decades trying to draw the public's attention to this crucial phenomenon. But we lack a comprehensive framework of what we mean by inequality and how we can tackle it. We hear and read a lot of inequality has increased, inequality has decreased, but few people actually take the time and make the effort to understand what inequality are we talking about, what measure are we using, and inequality among whom. Angus Deaton, another Nobel Prize, recently published a paper on COVID-19 and inequality, which received a lot of coverage, presenting it as showing that inequality has decreased with the pandemic. And this is also the way he sometimes presents it. But what he does find is that while global inequalities among countries have decreased with COVID-19, these have increased once we weight these countries with their population. And actually, when the trend differs if we change the measure. And this is something we also came across in the projects of the research facility. For instance, in Ghana, we find that consumption inequality has decreased while assets inequalities has increased. In South Africa, we see almost no evolution of inequality when measured with the Gini coefficient, while we see a slight decrease when we look at the Palmer ratio. So going back to the plumber story, if we want to support policies and strategies to reduce inequalities, we need to make sure that we have a consistent basis on which we can tell the story and that we have the right tools to do so. We are aware that producing measures and tools needs to be scientific, while the use of these measures and tools not always is. And this is why we need to be aware and promote the local ownership of these measures and tools. What will be presented in this session goes exactly in this direction. We have tried to identify and develop tools and measures which allow decision makers to be serious about inequality reduction. And we also took this one step further in supporting them in understanding and using these tools. Now, I would just like to highlight two of the challenges we were faced with when thinking seriously about inequality. These are not new and certainly not specific to the issue of the distribution, but they are crucial if we want to move forward. The first one is data, and the second one is the complexity of policy processes when it comes to reducing inequality. So starting with the data, we all say that we want to achieve SDG 10, but what do we know about its targets? Well, let's take the first one and probably the most well-known one, target 10.1, which is to reduce income inequalities. It requires actually for all countries to progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40 of the population at a rate higher than the national average. But when we look at the progress we've made so far, we see that we can only measure this for slightly more than half of the world's population. For the most recent period, 2012 to 2017, data were available for 91 countries, which cover actually 60% of the world's population. And this is not a lot. We can look at another target, like 10.4, for instance, which aims to adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage, and social protection policies, and progressively achieve greater equality by 2030. And this indicator is actually the labor share of GDP, comprising wages and social protection systems. And here, as you can see on the slide, the picture is even darker, or I should actually say lighter, as it appears that this figure is practically non-existent for low and middle income countries in the recent period. The picture is bleak, and it should actually make us realize that we cannot aim to reduce inequality if we do not have a common baseline from which we can measure the progress. Data is a tool, a crucial one, for inequality reduction. There's a lot of discussion on the need to have access to top income data, and this is part of the challenge, but the need for data on inequality goes beyond it. And as a segue, the way François Bourguignon very nicely puts it, the reason why we measure badly top income data, top incomes as a whole, is also the reason why we cannot do anything about income inequality. And this has to do with policies and the political economy of inequality reduction. The closing panel of this conference will talk about the political economy of inequality, so I will not dwell on this. I just want to say a few words on what are the policy options that we have in order to reduce inequalities. Now, the late and missed Stephen Classen and his team had actually proposed a framework for policies that can reduce inequalities, which shows both the complexity of it, but also the possibilities that we have. And this is the scheme that you see on the slide. First, you have the policies that aim to tackle asset inequalities, such as education and land reforms, let's say. Then we have the policies that aim to improve the returns for the assets of the poorest, of the most vulnerable. And these would be, for instance, labor market policies, or again, infrastructure policies. And then we have the policies that aim to increase redistribution by the state, and these will be fiscal and social policies. But on top of these, we need to add all the other policies that impact income distribution, such as monetary policies and governance, or trade policy also. And then we also need to add the international trends and policies that impact intra-country inequalities, such as tax transparency, such as international trade policy, and capital flows. Now, you see that while we have an idea of what are the policies that could lower inequality, we cannot say from the start which ones we need to use, nor the impact that these would have. The starting point should always be a clear understanding of key drivers of inequalities in a particular context, and then an analysis of the feasibility of each policy instrument. And on top of this, we need to add issues such as quality. Yes, we know that education policies and the expansion of the coverage of health systems decrease inequality, but this is only if these services, these education and health services are of quality. If not, they will just increase inequality even further. And then there's the issue of taking this knowledge from research to policy design. Abebe Shimles was saying a few days ago in another conference that policymakers have not listened to researchers about what kind of growth does not translate into an increase in inequality. We need to think about this and make sure we have the right tools to translate research into policy design, and that we will not stop there. We need to create the tools that allow us to go from policy design to policy implementation, and to ensure the ownership of these tools by our partners. So to very briefly sum up, tools are crucial, but so is their ownership. The current pandemic has negatively impacted the opportunities of the poorest. And this means that we are actually on the verge of an entrenchment of social and economic inequalities. So we must act quickly. Now that we have made a commitment, how do we get serious about it? This panel will give us a few insights on how do we track the impact of policies on inequality, but also poverty, and also how we can measure if development cooperation has an impact on income distribution. And while we are focusing here on inequalities within countries, we must not forget that today the highest inequalities remain those between countries and not within countries. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Ms. David. Thank you for your insight. And let me keep you with us for an extra minute with a good question we got from the audience addressed to you. The question is, what kind of indicators do you think could be proposed for development cooperation agencies?
Okay. So I do not want to get too much into the indicators, because one of the presentations will be on that. But I think what is important for development cooperation agencies such as AFD, but also the others, is to have a clear distinction among different types of indicators, that we need to have a look at the output indicators. So this would be typical ones such as the Gini coefficient, the income and non-income growth incidence curves, for instance. And then we'd also need to add intermediate indicators, which can monitor the changes in the asset distribution and the returns to these assets. So we can monitor things like agricultural productivity, or again, like the incomes or educational and health outcomes for households. We also need to have input indicators, because, for instance, projects that aim to improve education need to make, in this project, we need to make sure that we're delivered on these inputs. So do the interventions actually get realized, and in which conditions? And then we need to think about project level indicators, and these might be probably some of the most difficult ones. We'd also hope to get some insights from this panel, but I guess on the project level indicators, we would need to go more towards impact evaluation methods and comparisons between treated and non-treated areas.
Thank you, Ms. David, I'm sorry, for your presentation and for your answer and for setting the scene. We'll be able to hear more from you later on. And this is the time now for me to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Jan Jalema, who is the Deputy Director for the Commitment to Equity Project at GDN. Mr. Jalema has actually been practicing and applying CEQ assessment methodologies and CEQ developed methodological innovations, providing advice to governments and multilateral organizations in Africa, East Asia, South Asia, and Eastern Europe. And he has been leading trainings in CEQ assessment methods for close to a decade. Prior to joining the CEQ Institute, Jan worked for the World Bank as a poverty economist and social development specialist in Indonesia. Mr. Jalema, the floor is yours now.
Thank you kindly, Christina, and Anda as well for setting the scene so effectively. I also want to thank AFD and the EU for providing this opportunity for me to talk about the effectiveness of fiscal incidence analysis for precisely the issues that Anda raised, for generating evidence bases on which real action and feasible policy change can be made. I think I would like to use Anda's presentation as a segue to indicate that we at CEQ Institute, the Commitment to Equity Institute, and we who practice fiscal incidence analysis, I think are firmly convinced that all of the research and analytics that we can generate will always be for naught if there isn't some sort of local level ownership and indeed appreciation of the toolkits, the methodologies, and as well the results that we generate by those who actually control the policy levers. And one important aspect, I think, of the toolkit that I will present, as well as the rest of the toolkits that other presenters will demonstrate here, and that we'll discuss afterwards, is that they help to create, I think, a common language so that different actors from civil society, from within administrations, technocrats, bureaucrats, and lay people like myself alike are all speaking or can speak a common language, a language that appeals to everybody for its objectiveness and for its transparency as well. So without further ado, I will get into my particular corner of this world, but I think that the presentations which follow mine should indicate that the world is much broader indeed, and that there are many useful tools that we have at our disposal now for advancing these debates about the appropriate levels of inequality and what can be done to reduce inequality that we deem to be too high. So as I indicated, I think already, I am presenting from the Commitment to Equity Institute at Tulane University, and the Commitment to Equity Institute is in the business of helping development stakeholders and government policymakers generate fiscal incidence analyses that summarize the impact of fiscal policies in particular expenditure policy and education, revenue collection policy via a value-added tax or excise taxes on inequality and also poverty and other social welfare indicators. So what are CEQ assessments? What is the fiscal incidence analysis toolkit that I want to talk about today? The CEQ assessments are empirically grounded, comprehensive, and that's something that I'll come back to repeatedly, comprehensive and rigorous tax and benefit incidence analyses, which are transparent in method and application, and which facilitate fact-based, I think that's very important, engagement among development stakeholders on the following equity concerns. But by no means are we limited to these 4 bullets that I will read through. You'll see that the world that a CEQ assessment or a fiscal incidence analysis covers is much wider than just these, than the world represented by these 4 bullets. How much income redistribution and poverty reduction is being accomplished through fiscal policy? How equalizing and or pro-poor are specific taxes and specific government expenditure items? How effective are taxes and government expenditure items in reducing inequality and poverty, either overall or fiscal instrument by fiscal instrument? And what is the impact then of those of potential fiscal reforms, either on the revenue side or the expenditure side, that change the size or the progressivity of a particular tax or benefit? So what might we expect in terms of inequality reduction if we increase cash transfer spending and reduce, for example, fuel subsidy spending? For what reason are they empirically grounded, or for what reason do I claim that these are empirically grounded and transparent? Well, I don't think I can get through a comprehensive and clear answer to that on that question with just one slide alone, but I'd like to put before you this sort of foundational methodological slide that is behind a CEQ assessment, that is behind fiscal incidence analysis. These boxes on this slide, on this flowchart, represent different income concepts. The one that you're probably most familiar with is disposable income, which is right in the middle of these, of this flowchart. Disposable income is the income or consumption level which we usually quote poverty statistics about, or inequality statistics. But there's not just disposable income. One can imagine taking from disposable income the amount of money that individuals or households pay, for example, in value-added taxes. And one can imagine separating from disposable income the amount of money that an individual or household receives from, for example, a conditional cash transfer program. And up and down this flowchart are other hypothetical income concepts that include more or fewer of the fiscal items that I mentioned in the previous slide. And in this way, by disaggregating or by separating out returns from fiscal expenditures or benefits received from fiscal expenditures, as well as burdens created by revenue collection instruments, we can create different income concepts and examine inequality or poverty or other social welfare indicators at each of those different income concepts. And that is the way in which we at the CEQ Institute and via CEQ assessments determine what impact specific fiscal items are having on inequality, on poverty, on social welfare more generally. And so in this way, we mean it to be transparent. We mean it also to be empirically grounded, because it is in our methodology, in our fiscal incidence analysis, the way that we practice it, we always create a crosswalk between what is happening at the level of the administration, at the level of the FISC, with the various expenditure and revenue collection instruments, and the level of the individual or the level of the household as represented in, for example, a household budget survey or an income and expenditure survey or a living standards measurement survey. So in that way, a CEQ assessment is empirically grounded as well as being transparent. How do we use CEQ assessments? And when throughout this presentation, as I say CEQ assessment, what I have in my mind actually is fiscal incidence analysis. A CEQ assessment is a particular type of fiscal incidence analysis, and it's useful and we think desirable to do fiscal incidence analysis the CEQ assessment way for reasons that I will get to later. But in general, one could use not just CEQ assessments, but fiscal incidence analysis to look at the following questions, or to try and help governments or fiscal authorities achieve particular equity goals. So how do we do that? How might a CEQ assessment be used for helping governments achieve equity goals? Well, the first is to lay out, here's an example of CEQ assessments completed with AFD as a partner in Kenya, in Morocco, and in South Africa, based on data from approximately 4 or 5 years ago, but completed recently. And the idea behind this slide is to show that what a CEQ assessment does, first of all, is to quantify how much governments are actually spending on, for example, social policy, as represented by conditional cash transfers, social assistance, social protection spending, education and health expenditures, as well as on how much they're spending on subsidies, for example, for fuel or energy or for housing. And at the same time, to put into context the size of the revenues that are being collected from individuals. So via VAT or excise or personal income taxes or real estate taxes, to show how much fiscal agencies, the size of the burden that fiscal agencies are creating for individuals and households, as well as the size of the benefit pool that's available via expenditures. Why is that useful? Oops, I'm sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Why is that useful? Well, once you've been able to categorize all the expenditure and all the revenues that have been collected, say within a fiscal year, and then allocated all of those expenditures as benefits, or all of those revenues collected as burdens to individuals and households, we can start to put together indicators and summaries of how those particular fiscal items, taxes or expenditures, are affecting levels of poverty, levels of inequality, and what inequality and poverty would look like if those fiscal items weren't being executed. So here on this slide, I've made very small, unfortunately, a graph showing how much each decile in Morocco receives when individuals are ranked by pre-fiscal income, how much each decile receives of the total benefits available from flour subsidies. Those are the blue shaded bars on the very left-hand side of this figure, the figure on the left, the sugar subsidy, and the gas and energy subsidy in Morocco. And the height of the bars represents the share received by the decile of the total subsidy benefits available. And what's notable is that except for the flour subsidy in Morocco, both the sugar and the gas subsidy, richer households, those represented by lighter shaded bars, capture more of the subsidy benefits available. But if you go all the way over to the right-hand side of this graph, I put in the same graph what the subsidies received represent for households in the poorest decile and households in the richest decile as a share of their own income. So even though richer households are receiving quite a bit more from the sugar and gas subsidies overall, nonetheless, what they receive represents a far smaller share of their own consumption budget than do the same subsidies for poorer households. And that's why one cannot tell from the beginning just how useful subsidies will be. Pardon me a second, I've cut an interruption here.
Okay, so I guess this is what happens when it's COVID, business as usual. While our presenter is trying to come back, doing his fatherly duties, I think, I would also like to take this opportunity for one moment and share with you some important further goals of the research facility on inequalities. Let me see. Yes, are we going to wait for him to come back, or we will move on the next speaker? But
my sincere apologies. I will continue on through the 3 minutes that remain, if you don't mind.
Thank you for being back. Good
Sure.
to have you.
So the CEQ assessment takes levels of expenditure, levels of revenue collection, and tries to determine exactly what impact those fiscal instruments are having on inequality, on poverty, and on social welfare more generally, the welfare of individuals and households. Here are the same 3 countries, Kenya, Morocco, and South Africa, as well as some comparator countries. And this graph puts into perspective how these fiscal instruments, in Kenya, Morocco, and South Africa, and the allocation of those fiscal instruments to households and individuals change the impact or change the levels of inequality in this graph, as well as on the levels of poverty that exist in those same countries, so Kenya, Morocco, and South Africa. What impact those fiscal items have on inequality and poverty. Whew, pardon me, I've lost my breath running up and down the stairs. So in Kenya, as in the rest of the comparative countries, as well as Morocco and South Africa, the fiscal policy represented in this graph does indeed reduce inequality by approximately 9 percentage points. In South Africa, the same fiscal policy, the same expenditures and revenues reduce inequality by almost 20 percentage points. The impact on poverty is not always, doesn't always line up with the impact of fiscal policy on inequality. So in Kenya, for example, fiscal policy, the combination of expenditures and revenues, indeed increases the poverty headcount ratio by 5.6 percentage points. While in South Africa, at the opposite end of the spectrum, fiscal policy is both poverty reducing as well as inequality reducing. How can we use these tools in the future? This is how we've used them as a result or during our engagement with AFD, but how else might they be used? Well, the major advantage of the CEQ assessment and a comprehensive and methodologically similar fiscal incidence analysis is that the more countries that are covered, the larger or the broader is the benchmarking possibility of assembling all of these results for each country and using them in a common framework. So that CEQ assessment country coverage over time has come to cover quite a number of the countries, some of which were blank on Anda's first few slides, others of which are not covered. We can also use CEQ assessments in the results and indicators available for SDG 10.4.2 in particular, as well as some of the debates and discussions that SDG 1 and SDG 10 put forth. So it's difficult to tell, but from this graph, we could actually generate SDG indicator 10.4.2, which will be provided now in addition to the original SDG indicator 10.4.1, which tracked the labor share of income. We can also use CEQ assessments as evidence or as inputs to a debate surrounding specific equity issues, for example, in South Africa, with respect to housing subsidies. We can also use fiscal incidence analysis and CEQ assessments more generally in the following sense. Sustainable development plans and growth frameworks will create winners and losers. That is, some who will benefit immediately and by a lot, and others who will benefit by not as much, and perhaps over time lose slowly from their current position. So for example, will climate change and climate change mitigation policies impact women more so than men? Will the funding or the revenues collected for those policies impact women or children, for example, more than men or older adults, working age adults? will the climate change mitigation policies that are put in place ameliorate or exacerbate the worsening inequality of opportunity that climate change itself creates? And furthermore, are there links, therefore, between SDGs 1.10 and 4, which has to do with education, and 5, which has to do with gender equality, and 8, which has to do with decent work for all, and 13 on climate action? So CEQ assessments and fiscal incidence analysis provide an impact lens for these interdependent equity concerns. And that is all I have. And my apologies again for the interruption, and sorry for taking more than my allotted time.
Mr. Jellema, you'll stay in my heart as one of the most memorable presenters and fathers of the year of 2021. So thank you. Let me pose a question to you. It's a serious and complex one. How do you aim to introduce the issue of the quality of services in the fiscal incidence analysis?
Indeed, that is a tricky one. The quality of services is an issue that cuts right to the heart of not just inequality with respect to income, but also inequality with respect to opportunity. So not just with respect to outcomes, but also with respect to opportunities. And the answer is that the more data is available on quality and quality levels of quality and quality concerns and how the quality of services varies by region, or for men versus women, or for children versus older aged individuals, the more easily we can translate that into levels of expenditures or levels of revenue collection that then in turn have an impact on these individuals and households to which we allocate. So the more that we know about the contours of the distribution of the quality inherent in any service provision, either by a fiscal agency, a municipal level agency, or a district level agency, or even a national level agency, the more interesting indicators and the more interesting the debate becomes, because we can begin to examine what impact quality itself is having on inequality. So that's not a that's a call in the end for more and better data to support these fiscal incidence analyses and more sophisticated insights into the debates surrounding equality, not just inequality, not just of outcomes, but of opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Jellema. We would like to have you back for more later, if it's possible. Now let me turn to Mr. Murray Lebrun, the director of the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research within the African Research Universities Alliance. Let me shortly introduce him a little longer. Mr. Lebrun also holds the National Research Foundation Research Chair in Poverty and Inequality Research. And he's the director of the Southern Africa Labor and Development Research Unit in UCT School of Economics. He is one of the principal investigators of the National Income Dynamics Study. Good to see you again, Mr. Lebrun, after having you set the scene in the African Inequality session this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll just wait to see my slides. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And to introduce you to a diagnostic tool that the African Center of Excellence has developed with the AFD in grounding our research and linking our research to the policy community in our countries. I was going to give you some African context. That seems, given Anders' brilliant introduction, that's hardly necessary. Let me just contextualize. Let me skip some slides in order to save some time and take you to this slide, which goes directly to where Anders was taking us in the introduction. in the sense that why are we doing this? Why are we wanting to understand inequalities? I thought that Ander gave us a great introduction. Now, this is a famous triangle due to Francois Bourguignon that just shows or represents the fact that we've learned that although Africa has had very strong economic growth along with the rest of the world, it's fallen off the last few years, but nonetheless, it was very strong. The actual impacts of that on poverty reduction in the continent which dominates the world poverty agenda and therefore the lowest parts of the world in income distribution has been very disappointing. And the reason for that is this connection. The texture of society is the inequalities in our countries across the continent. And so to push forward in dealing with both poverty and general development, it's essential to grapple with our inequalities. And in a sense, that was the founding premise of the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research. It's not just a single-minded focus on inequality, ignoring poverty and ignoring the broader development issues. No, it's a recognition of the centrality of inequality and inequality dynamics in understanding livelihoods of people across our continent, but across the world, actually. So we were founded much in line with the start of this facility. And the reason I give you this picture is it's from our launch workshop that we had together. And there are 3 centers, there are 3 country nodes in the African Center of Excellence, South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana. And this picture includes really, really top African researchers from each of those nodes, but also includes members of the national statistical offices from each of those nodes, and even from elsewhere in the continent. And that's a key point to make, that the African Center of Excellence has sought to produce excellent research, but in the locations that we're at, closely linked to our national statistical offices and the data production in our countries, closely linked to the processes that are deriving the SDGs, so that there's a link between our research and those processes and the social engagement going forward. We have grand aspirations to be center stage of our continent dealing with its own issues. And the diagnostic really is a tool to support that. So the diagnostic really is a way that the African Center of Excellence has proceeded to get going with its work in each country context. What is it? It's a comprehensive report, a diagnosis, if you like, of inequalities in each of the 3 countries, but now there's a demand for such a diagnosis from much more broadly around the continent, given what this diagnosis actually does. And so what do? We consolidate data that's around. That's why the links to the National Statistical Office is so important. We take stock, we diagnose the inequalities in each of our contexts with the best available data, the best available research, and we put it together in a diagnosis then. What does the inequality situation look like in South Africa, one of the world's highest inequality contexts, in Ghana, and in Kenya? And what's the point of that? Well, if you produce that and you produce it with the data producers of the country and the SDG producers of each country, that then serves as a basis for launching a national dialogue about inequality and policies to overcome inequality, but on the foundation of the diagnosis. And so we were successful in each of our 3 country contexts in actually working closely with the National Statistical Offices, but the very people who produce the SDG reporting for poverty and for inequality and for many of the other SDGs. And so therefore, this diagnosis then is a tool for all. The picture, okay, so in a sense, as part of that diagnosis, how do we prepare the diagnostic report? I've already discussed who we have in the room. It's a lot of hard work, not just getting the data into shape, assessing the quality of the data so that the country itself can own its data resource and start to use it. But then we need a very accurate assessment of the quality of those data, a point that underflagged earlier. We also started to build the capacity in the country to analyze these data. How do you analyze inequality? How do you prepare a diagnostic for yourself? So the picture on the right is a handbook that we produced that any country can use. We've used it intensively in 3 country contexts, but it's available as a resource for a country that wants to produce its own diagnostic. And then, if possible, consolidate the data in a data hub so that it becomes available for research use in the national dialogue around solving your inequalities problem. That's not frontier academic work, but it's foundational and crucial. So these diagnostics in each of the 3 countries offer a multidimensional profiling using the data, the best we have to offer of the inequality situation in 3 countries. On the left-hand side, I'm not sure how visible the graph is, but hopefully it's visible. On the left-hand side is from the Kenyan diagnostic, and all it shows is the share of in this case, per capita expenditure going to each of the deciles of the distribution. And so the top decile gets 31 or so percent, but that's risen over time of all of the income. It's the top 10% of the population gets more than the lion's share. That's true in any country. In South Africa, that is not 31, 41, it's 55 and rising. That of the total income in the country that accrues to the top 10% of the population. And the top 1% of that takes the lion's share of that as well. So it's a different texture to inequality that is profiled off the basis of careful data work. The graph on the right is a map from the South African diagnostic, and it's about the proportion of households with access to electricity by district. And it took a combination of data. We need the census for that, but we also need other data sources to triangulate and make sure that that's true. It shows pockets of vulnerability. It's a very sad picture of South Africa because the most vulnerable areas are the same areas that were historically marginalized under apartheid and under colonialism, even going way back. This map has become very important in and has been adjusted through some research that we've done for COVID vulnerability. It's become very useful as a platform for that. Okay, so, and this morning, Damiano Manda gave a detailed presentation on the Kenyan diagnostic, and there was also a detailed discussion of the South African and Ghanaian diagnostic. Here they are. All 3 of them were produced, have been produced, and in the South African case, it's even an official statistical release of the National Statistical Office. It's South Africa's first inequality inequality report. In the Kenyan case, similarly, it's about to be released. In the Ghanaian case, in November last year, there was a lovely function where the statistician general, or the director general of statistics, as they call it in Ghana, was the keynote speaker and talking about how important this was. So let's build on then, and let's use the last few minutes to show, okay, it's a diagnostic report. There's a lot of careful work that goes into it, but it's designed to be much more. It's not, this is not the end of the process. This is the beginning. And it's a consolidation process that pulls in key players around the data. But once the data is produced, there's an engagement, a series of engagements in each context around which we say, okay, what is this diagnostic saying? And let's start the discussion then about what are we going to do about this? And the stats agency can talk about its SDG reporting, and but in the picture here, from the South African stakeholder engagement, we have the gentleman standing up is the head of policy in the presidency in South Africa, and he's leading the discussion. This is not ASA's discussion. This has now gone beyond ASA and is stimulating a national dialogue. The people sitting at the table, there's a lady from Oxfam, South Africa, who belongs in the discussion too, because this is owned by the country. It's a civil engagement, it's a national engagement. And the other two gentlemen are working on the Presidency Economic Advisory Council. And so that's the quality of the engagement. And these engagements are really impactful. But again, they're the beginning. It takes a lot of hard work then to drive off those engagements. And there's great interest from around the continent in then having cross-national engagements. The national statistical officers who participated are interested in pushing the agenda across the continent in this way. Okay, let's skip the slide. It was just designed to show that we had a very impactful engagement in Ghana too, carefully structured each step of the way. Is intentional. You've got to put these engagements together very, very carefully, and you have to have the credibility to do that. Otherwise, otherwise you can't do this. So we're launching a process, not ending a project. When we do these stakeholder engagements, it's the launching of the follow-on process, but off the platform of having done some careful work. Okay. So just to push on with that point then in closure. The key point of the diagnostic then is to consolidate our data, but also to build the indigenous relationships around the data production, SDG reporting, and then to push on into policy evaluation, again in an indigenous way. And it's very complementary to the presentation that Jan has just given. So in the South African case, the diagnostic then was twinned, again, ASA playing a catalyzing or partnership role to a new CEQ exercise in the country with the National Treasury, therefore bringing in new data, the type of data that Jan showed, data on the taxes and the incidence of the taxes, data on social expenditures, social grants, but also data on education, health. What does the budget look like? How well are we doing? We're pushing the dial beyond the diagnostic to a beginning to assess our policies. But in the same framework, Treasury are very interested in South Africa in building the same indigenous capacity to use this work in their budgeting process themselves. It's very exciting. It's a credit to all of us, really. There's similar complementarities to Oxfam. We'll hear about the Oxfam tool just now. It's very synergistic to all of this, but that brings in the community side, not just the policy side, the community side. In the South African context and in all three nodes, spatial mapping, spatial inequality analysis is through the National Statistical Office is also on the agenda. In the South African case, we've even made progress in working with our tax data, which is the preserve generally of Thomas Piketty and the developed countries, but that's not good enough. tax data is crucial in addressing our inequalities policies. Okay, so ASA is a really excellent research center, but we've taken on this role of the diagnostic in linking our research to the policy community, and hopefully I've given you a sense of how that all works. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lebrun. And as you said, we're going to hear from the representative of Oxfam in a minute, but let me not let you go first. Let me ask you a pretty general question from a bird's eye view. What do you see as maybe the most important or most notable common traits of inequality among the three countries?
Well, there are two. So in each of the three countries, the diagnostic surfaces the fact that in the daily livelihoods of people, the labor market and its dynamics are crucial. But the texture of how those labor markets work, each of the diagnostics teases out three very different labor markets. In South Africa, the labor market is much closer to a developed country, high technology. We're worrying about the missing middle in our labor market. In Kenya, there's a strong focus, as Damian Amanda said this morning, about the rural sector and how it articulates with the urban sector, and the urban informal sector and its dynamics are absolutely crucial. So that's one prong. On the other side, the diagnostics have been incredibly useful in surfacing the type of assets, including human capital assets, including education and health, and the inequities in those assets by gender, for example, that are absolutely crucial to different livelihood strategies. And I think the diagnostics have done really well on not just focusing on the labor market, but focusing on some of the wealth and asset issues that are crucial, but very different in each context. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to have you soon back again for more questions. And now I am honored to introduce our fourth speaker, Ms. Anna Claver, a project manager on inequalities at Oxfam Intermon. Ms. Claver has 15 years of experience in development, social mobilization, and advocacy work, and a deep passion for citizen engagement in the public and political spheres for about 5 years now at Oxfam. Among a lot of other things, Ms. Claver was a member of the team at the International Inequalities Institute, which developed the multidimensional inequality framework. Ms. Claver, let me give the floor to you now.
Thank you so much, Christina, for the introduction. And thank you to the organizers, well, the colleagues in the table, and also the audience for this space and the opportunity to present this multidimensional inequality framework, a tool that we have applied in West Africa, in Central America, and in Vietnam, in partnership with the French Agency for International Development, but also the Spanish Agency for International Development and Cooperation, and also the Mekong Development Research Institute in Vietnam. So as you can see, and as you are currently only seeing me, there's a whole team behind this work, and I would like to thank you for them all. So please, next slide. I mean, in my presentation, first thing is to say, what's the multidimensional inequality framework? And it is a tool, in a session of tools, it is a tool to measure and understand inequalities, developed in collaboration with the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics, as you just mentioned, Christina, and the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and Oxfam. From our perspective as Oxfam, as a civil society organization, we needed a new tool to help us expand and deepen our understanding and narratives on inequalities, their potential drivers and potential solutions, including policy solutions for inequality reduction in different contexts and as means to a greater impact. Thinking of what gaps were we trying to address when we developed this tool, You are all familiar with Oxfam work and reports on income and wealth inequality, and this reflects a general tendency to focus on economic measures of inequalities. But we felt that we needed new tools to move beyond, to grasp the full nature and scope of inequalities, moving beyond economics and towards this multidimensional approach. So next slide, please. So what does this framework looks like? Based on the human capabilities approach by Amartya Sen, the MIF, as we call it, the MIF has three dimensions, has three pillars. One, to measure and analyze inequalities, expressions or outcomes of inequalities. Second, to examine drivers of inequalities. And a third one, to explore potential solutions, including public policies. The framework, as you can see in that drawing, in the slide, in that chart, the framework captures inequalities in 7 areas or domains that matter for human life, such as health, education, dignified work, or political participation, influence, and voice. Each of these 7 domains has a number of suggested indicators and measures, almost 200, capturing or trying to capture the differences between groups of people. These indicators are comprehensive but not exhaustive. One should feel free to leave measures which are not applicable or relevant to the context, and add measures that we maybe, or they are maybe missing. Actually, or in fact, this is one of the strengths of this framework, its flexibility and capacity to adapt to different contexts. And one important thing regarding the measurement dimension is the relevance of variables of disaggregation. It is the comparison between different characteristics or attributes of people in a given context, whether they be income level or gender, race, ethnicity, or age, what allows to look at vertical, horizontal, and spatial inequalities at the same time. So next slide, please. And we all know, and I'm sure that we all here in this conference have faced many data challenges regarding these variables of disaggregation, which is something that we will talk later in the recommendations section. So what about the context of this research and this tool? The framework has been implemented at different levels and at different contexts. Under this AFD EU research facility, it has been implemented, as I said, in West Africa, in Central America, and in Vietnam at national level. All the studies aim to look at what were 3 questions. What are the most relevant inequalities in a number of selected prioritized domains relevant to those contexts? What forces are driving those inequalities? As well as finally, suggest or develop a number of policy recommendations and strategies for inequality reduction. So if we see the next slide, please, what about the results? Just showing in this chart, just showing the results that the MIF has facilitated in its multidimensional diagnostic of inequalities in West Africa. If we look at this chart and looking at inequalities drivers and potential solutions in 5 countries of this region, the main conclusions are, first, that intersecting inequalities by gender, place of residence, age, and by income level play an important role in shaping the opportunities of people at every life domain, particularly in the domains of education and dignified work. Or, for example, regarding spatial inequalities, that is especially important in the case of health, of inequalities regarding health, which is something, actually, spatial inequalities that Murray Librand and Asay pointed out in the session this morning about African inequalities, and we totally agree with that. So according to these inequalities, what are the policy or what are the recommendations for reducing inequalities in West Africa in this case? Reducing inequalities requires a set of policies clearly targeted at the most remote rural areas to correct for spatial inequalities and towards women, young people, and other marginal groups. That set of policies, I mean, the emphasis here is on the approach and the target and not the policy pack. But that policy pack includes adequate investment in basic services such as health, education, or social protection, something already mentioned and highlighted yesterday in the opening panel of this conference, and even well, that has revealed even more relevant in a time of a pandemic. Second, investment in agricultural policies. Third, or labor rights, dignified work, and of course, invest and promote progressive taxes. Next slide, please. In a similar way, as you can see in the chart, these are the results of applying the multidimensional inequality framework in Central America and Dominican Republic. In this case, the main policy recommendation is to change the productive model, is to build productive ecosystems in areas of social exclusion, to bridge the gaps in the labor market, and towards particularly address or targeting women again and young people again, along with an adequate vocational and accessible vocational and educational training. And finally, just as another example of results in our research in Vietnam, carried out in partnership with the McKern Development Research Institute, the study shows that despite the strong record of the country in poverty reduction for the last 30 years, there are still, well, there are persistent inequalities when crossing income and spatial inequalities with ethnicity, particularly in the access to education, health, and the capacity of certain groups to have a say or influence in the public arena, in decisions that affect them, especially women. The main recommendation in this study, for example, is that stakeholders must adopt and encourage a human and well-being approach to in the design of public policies and the implementation, and not only an economic approach. Having said that, next slide, please, Diego. Thanks so much. I couldn't help in a session about tools to measure and analyze inequalities include, no, next one, Diego, please. It is slide about that one. Thank you so much. As I was saying, I couldn't help include one slide about what are the results of the tool itself. I mean, what lessons have we learned? What difference does the myth make? As you can see, different points in the slide, but I'm going to focus on three things. First, 4 months ago, we asked some Oxfam colleagues, researchers, and experts who applied the myth what made it unique. And the common answer was that the framework gives you the big picture of inequalities, as complex as it is, emphasizing well-being and not only income aspects. So the framework gives you a comprehensive and evidence-based diagnostic of inequalities, but also it provides practical guidance, both quantitative and qualitative, and actually we are working more on this qualitative dimension of knowledge and how to integrate it in the research and analysis of inequalities. As I was saying, practical guidance for decision makers, academics, and practitioners to explore also drivers and potential solutions. A second difference that the myth makes is that it allows to look at economic, social, and spatial inequalities, also political inequalities at the same time, as well as gender, race, or other identity-based discriminations. We know that a multidimensional and intersectional analysis is not about adding dimensions and attributes to inequality, but trying to establishing and deeply understanding the interlinkages and the interactions about all those dimensions and characteristics. And last but not least, and connecting with the presentation of Murray, talking about engagement and how the assay diagnostic of inequalities also help with this. The MIF gathers multi-stakeholders around the same table. In our experience, the framework is particularly useful, is of great value in those processes seeking to bring different stakeholders to the table to discuss about inequality. For instance, in Vietnam, the MIF research and the research process has allowed us to establish conversations with three key ministries, absolutely key in the fight to inequalities, like, well, ministries of health, labor, and planning and investment, for example. So finally, I'm moving to what recommendations come out or emerge from the experience of the multidimensional inequality framework. Next slide, please, Diego. As you can see, there are many. Well, I mentioned some of the recommendations on concrete policies, on concrete context some slides ago in West Africa, in Central America, and in Vietnam. And in addition to that, there are some recommendations coming out in all the studies, regardless the context. I've summarized some of those points in the slides, but I will mention, or I will focus in just 3 points, main 3 points. First, and particularly addressed to international organizations, decision makers, donor agencies, and national governments involved, commit or maintain and strengthen your commitment to mainstream inequality reduction with concrete measures such as embedding inequality reduction into your plans and strategies, or monitoring and assessing development and aid in terms of inequality reduction, something that the MIF could help with. Second, something that comes out again, regardless the context, encourage transparency, citizen participation, and social accountability as means to reduce social, political, and economic inequalities. And finally, and next slide, please, keep supporting the analysis and the research to measure and understand inequalities from a multidimensional and intersectional perspective. This research facility has been a fruitful and necessary space for exploring and exchanging about different inequalities in different contexts, different disciplines and backgrounds and perspectives. We need more of this. And supporting the analysis of inequalities implies that devolution of metrics that the UNDP calls for, as many colleagues actually have already highlighted before in this conference, but not only in terms of measuring inequalities beyond economics, but also in terms of generating more and better data, which is something that, well, Anda pointed out at the beginning of this session, and also I'm sure Ateir, well, and Murray have a lot to say on this. The multidimensional inequality framework is an indicator-driven tool with more than 1,000 measures, which allow to identify very specific data gaps in concrete context. This is important, and I'm doing my final point, because identifying this specific context data gaps means identifying who is being left behind so that we can bring them or bring those gaps to the surface. There's no way we can make progress towards a fair, inclusive, and sustainable world if it's not with all of us on board. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Clever. You've shared so many various tools and phases of development of tools from your experience. Can you share with us maybe what the next multidimensional inequality framework applications you may be conducting?
Well, how to say in brief, we are actually we have applied, well, the colleagues in Guatemala, for example, have applied a multidimensional inequality framework, and also the colleagues in Spain some years ago, and now the colleagues in El Salvador in Central America, they are actually almost finishing the implementation of this framework, or I would say of an improved framework, because we did an exercise to reflect and evaluate about the challenges of the framework. So we are applying it, and they are almost reaching the end of this research process in El Salvador, and we are developing, based on the recommendations that we have received about the tool, we are developing 2 new, guides or practical guidance to strengthen the gender and the feminist approach of the framework, meaning adopting a critical feminist perspective in the analysis of inequalities, and also, as I said before, a qualitative or a mixed methods approach to be able not to rely only on statistical and quantitative data, but be able to capture other kinds of knowledge, other kind of languages and the experiences of people who experience inequality in their everyday lives. So that would be it.
Extremely interesting. Thank you very much for sharing and for your input for our session on tools. We'll have more questions to you soon. And last but not least, I'd like to ask Mr. Christian Morabito to present his findings. But let me again tell the audience some background information on our panelist first. Dr. Morabito has been an international researcher and consultant with more than 15 years of experience in various fields related to our topic. He has worked with the United Nations, the World Bank, and the European Commission in managing and evaluating poverty reduction and educational programs, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. As a lead researcher for Save the Children, one of Dr. Morabito's recent commitments was a project to develop indicators to measure multidimensional child poverty and educational poverty and inequality in Italy and Europe. It is an honor to have you with us, Dr. Morabito.
Thank you so much. I will start by saying that this is a collective work. So I'm just here presenting, but behind me, there are 2 other great people. One guy is Mario Negre and the other is Miguel Niño Sarasua. So I'm presenting on behalf of that. I hope it will be fine. So in the study and methodology that we develop, we start from 2 assumptions, basically. The first assumption is that impact of the development cooperation interventions on inequality are difficult to measure at macro level because there's a myriad of factors and drivers of inequality. So it's extremely complicated to see the impacts of a development cooperation program or project. It's like a bit a drop in the ocean, if you want, right? And on the other hand, you have number of studies that try to do that, and they're certainly very useful, but they're sometimes complex and demand technical expertise, a lot of technical expertise, time consuming and also very expensive. So we start from these 2 assumptions and we try to say, let's try to do something basically a bit the opposite. And so we develop a methodology that is rapid, basically, accessible, so it can be used by many people, and cost effective. And we try to look basically at the first step of inequalities. So to basically, as some colleagues said before, so basically to check whether really in the design of the programs, and then of course in the implementations, the beneficiaries of these programs are the ones at the bottom of the income distribution. So it's the basic point, because after that you can see that you potentially reduce inequality. So that's the idea that we develop. And it's a very simple idea, actually. And so we've been testing this methodology with 3 funded projects by AFD. And now I will explain you a bit how this methodology works. First of all, we have a series of, let's say, steps to follow. So imagine that you are a person in a development cooperation agency who wants to do something, a program on reducing inequality. The first thing first you have to say, you have to look at data. So inequality situation drivers, and we explain a bit how does it work in terms of data and how you read the data, because it's not easy to do it. And secondly, once you decide maybe what you want to do, what area you want to work on, and then, of course, the project that you want to develop, we basically structure a scoreboard of inequality markers to assess whether inequality reduction is a focus of your project program. We talk about documents. It can be a strategy of a government, of your own program, and it can be do ex ante, of course, and ex post. I will show you a bit later how this works. And then, of course, you have statistical tools. You have one statistical tool that's been presented by Jon, and it's fundamental, which is the commitment for equity. And you look at whether you're doing, for instance, budget support. You look at the effects of budget support operation, or if you have a program or project, you look whether this project or program disproportionately benefits the one at the bottom of the income, so the 40% income group. So that's the scoreboard. I mean, we are still editing the colors. I like the colors, but we will see whether they will remain like that. So as you can see, there's basically a major inequality marker. So you have to raise yourself a question whether the inequality is not targeted in your project or program, or is a significant objective, or is the principal objective. And then you have a series of questions that you can ask yourself and reply in order to check. It's a kind of checklist, if you want, for the program design, and then some other considerations that you can take. For instance, if there could be like some negative trade-off that you don't think. Example, I'm doing an income support program, whether there's a negative trade-off on labor, it's an example. Or if you think about doing something for a small and medium enterprise, and you focus not on informal sector. So in this case, you have limitations on your project. So there's kind of numbers of steps and things that you can take into account when you're doing a project, and therefore to understand ex ante, ex post, whether it is in your marker, when you mark it, whether it is focusing on inequality or not. And then there's the second part, which is the more statistical part. And so we have to start from another assumption here, that any project can reduce or not inequalities, any program and any policy. As John Atkinson used to say, it's about how it is designed and the direction it takes, right? And so we start from this assumption and say, okay, it's very complicated to see the impacts at macro level, but we can see at least if at the start you focus precisely your program on some specific beneficiaries, and if you disproportionately benefit, your project benefit the one at the bottom of the income distribution, and it's in line of the SDG 10, if you want. In fact, it looks at both sides of the SDG 10. One is the focus on the bottom 14 in terms of income, and the other is also about the opportunity part. You say that, that social economic outcomes might be distributed equally. And so you can see, for instance, the link between this and other SDGs in education or in health, whether you are disproportionately benefit the bottom 40 income and wealth or not. And we relied on that on the equity tool. That is a very simple tool. It's 12 to 15 questions tailored to every country, and you identify the wealth quintile of the participant. And you can also add questions about gender, so you can see interaction between income and gender in this case, age groups, etc., etc. And of course, look at geographical level. And the other one is the very famous commitment for equity that we heard before. And then I'm not going to explain that because everyone knows a bit right now. So I jump on the 3 case studies that we did. So we take 3 programs financed by AFD. There are 3 different programs. So he wants to check whether the methodology works in different scenarios. The first is a program in Tunisia. It's Proville program. Actually, it was a program about improving basic infrastructures in 140 neighborhoods, districts, with low access to social services and high population density. that was actually made after the Arab Springs in Tunisia. It was, the intention was to look at imbalances, cohesion that you find in urban areas, right? The second is typical budget support program. So you have in Colombia a reform of health sector that wants to be more egalitarian, and therefore the AFD jumped in and support the budget for this reform. So it's a typical budget reform. And the third, it's a smaller program in terms of size in Cameroon, and it's support for the small, medium enterprise in rural areas to improve their capacity of doing business, basically. Unfortunately, we could only look at documentation analysis, scoreboard for the Cameroon, because due to COVID, we couldn't conduct the statistical analysis. So I will focus on the results on Tunisia and Colombia. So Tunisia, as you might see from the colors of our scoreboard, it is, the objective of reduction in inequality is a significant objective, but we cannot say that this is the principal objective, and I'll explain you why. Because of a bit of terminology, if you want. So it's very important to look at documentation, how you write the project and how you conceive a project. Because, it was targeting on, in French, we say quartier populaire, which means like popular neighborhoods. But in reality, in the terminology of Tunisia, does not necessarily mean neighborhoods with high incidence of poverty. It's highly densely populated neighborhood, but not necessarily poor neighborhoods. But you see, in any case, they have in other parts of the scoreboard some green, and yellow. So it's a bit of mixed, if you want. So we, by looking at this scoreboard, we then conducted an equity toll survey with the beneficiaries. So basically, what we did was to randomly select 5,000 households in the 124 neighborhoods that were beneficiaries from this program, and so you can see the graph there. There are much more results that we develop, but of course that's the main results. So result indicates that the project reached just over 40% of the poorest households in urban area, suggesting that of course there's an inequality reduction effects, but it's quite small because we want to see disproportionately favoring the 40%. Bottom 40% income household, right? So it's just above 40%. So the share of project beneficiaries at the 40% goes down when you take into account the size and the density of the population within the targeted neighborhoods. So, and that's even an addition in complications. We found a degree of heterogeneity across governorates, meaning the different regions. So it doesn't change much across regions, and also across age groups and gender. So the conclusion that we might have in both the analysis of the scoreboard and the statistical analysis that we conduct is that, the project reached just over 40% of the poorest households in urban areas, suggesting that it's a small inequality reducing effect. As I said, this is reduced even more by taking into account density of the population, for instance, and but it's still quite the same if we take into account other variables. But what we did was to compare the households that they were beneficiaries and tested through this survey with other urban households. But if you extend this analysis to the national level, so you include also rural area, the share of the beneficiaries, the poorest beneficiaries, drops dramatically. So if you think about a contribution to the national level reduction of inequalities, it is not the case. It can be smaller within rural areas if you just consider the rural areas, but actually that was the objective of the project. We just extend the view to check about much larger, spectrum at national level. And then Colombia, as you see, it's much more. The color are different here, and it's much more hectic if you want. So in terms of the objective, it was the principal objective because, as I said, in Colombia, AFD wanted to support a reform of the health sector towards a more egalitarian access to some specific health services. But as you might see, there are some pieces that are not green in any way. So you might find some problems, you know, within the design of the programs. So we conducted the statistical analysis, but in this case, we did on the budget, right? And we use for this purpose the commitment for equity, and we raised 3 questions. The first is basic. So because you have to assume that budget support, meaning that the funds from the AFD goes towards the budget of Colombia, and so follow the same trend and pattern of the budget of Colombia. So you have to ask yourself the first questions, whether the budget of Colombia, so the government redistribution works, and therefore you have to compare inequality in the market and what happens in inequality once the government intervenes after government redistribution. First question. Second question, has budget support in the health sector achieved equalizing effects? And this we compare the concentration coefficient for health with the Gini coefficient. If it's below that level, it means that it is equalizing. But we want to see also if it's equalizing pro-poor, because you can also equalize between the middle and the high. And therefore, this coefficient must be negative. That's our conclusion. And then we will see what happened. And of course, to understand how much budget goes to the bottom 40 in the health sector. Okay, first questions. Yeah, I mean, we can say that the government of Colombia budget redistribution, so there is through the budget and the intervention of government, it happens, but it is, you know, not that strong as we want to see. Look at the cents there. So market income inequality goes down from 0.575 to 0.515 after accounting for monetary interventions of government. So there's a limited distribution capacity of the Colombian government in these respects. So with the intervention of AFD, so the flow of the monetary flow of AFD towards the health sector budgets, now we want to see whether it is the coefficient concentration of the health with this intervention of the health sector is minor than the Gini index for market income, and it is. The Gini is blue, so you see that the red, which is the health sector concentration coefficient, is lower. Then we can assume that it is equalizing. But is it equalizing for the poorest? Not necessarily, because it's positive. You know, you see other sectors like education in yellow equalize more and more towards the poorest. That's something to take into account. And we can see that. So, I mean, when we look precisely at the health sector, 32% of health spending went to the bottom 40. Therefore, less than, it does not disproportionately benefit the bottom 40. So we saw that. So the result indicate in distribution in distributive gaps of approximately 8% to make health spending strictly for poor. There are equalizing, but not strictly for the poorest. So conclusions remark about our methodology. In practical terms, it's quite effective to identify whether cooperation programs focus on the bottom 14 income groups. Overall, the resource, underscore the importance of really considering a pro-poor targeting. But I want to say something about it. That does not mean that the project or a program must specifically focus on reducing inequality to actually reduce inequality. As we said, any program can reduce inequality, right? It does not mean, but we need to, of course, look whether and ensure that is looking for it. And also that you need to, it doesn't mean that with the targeting only you can reduce inequality. Imagine for education, no? You have universal access to education. Universality is the best way to, as we know, to reduce inequality and to equalize chances, right? So we're not advocating specifically for, let's say, targeting, although it's fundamental. We can also use the methodology to see what's going on in a universal system. Because remember, in Europe, we have a universal system for education, but we're still having inequality. So it's the way to see whether we are focusing on the poor in our action, whether directly, indirectly, whether through targeting or not through targeting. That's the idea, basically. And so correct the way. Voila, that's the point. Limitations, of course, is about data. In both cases, the equity tool and the commitment for equity, if you don't have data, you don't have a data availability, it's becoming extremely complicated. But we are working on adapting the same concept to other case scenarios and using other eventual source of data, whether these are not available. So to try to work it out solutions, that's the best way we can do. The scoreboard is still quite subjective, if you think about it, because we assess documentation, and therefore we have a subjective view on that. So we need to test and test again in order to build cases, and make it a bit more objective, so people can see from others what they did, and eventually try to translate in their own programs or cases. The strengths, as we said, is that it's very practical and straightforward. Just to tell you that 5,000 households analyzed, we did with the local company. It was very easy. We take a month and a half, and it was very cheap. That's what I want to say. And if you do it properly, that company gives you the result. Oh, okay, we worked it out. But if for a person that is in a delegation or whatever, to can have already result that can see, the points. So it can be done ex ante or ex post to assess. And just to tell you that all the study that we did accounted just for 2% of the overall technical assistance that was planned for these 3 programs. So it's feasible in economic terms, and give you plenty of information that you can use to understand whether you are doing or not, or you're focusing or not on the bottom 40 as a starting point to reduce inequalities. Methodology can assist international development agency on reporting process on achieving SDG target. And as I said, also interaction between SDG 10 and other SDGs, the SDG for gender, for instance, or in terms of what's happened for the bottom 40 income population children or other age groups, and also take the both sides of the SDG 10, focus on the bottom 40 and focus on equal opportunities. Thanks so much.
Mr. Morabito, thank you very much. It was really enjoyable and very, very interesting. And you've concluded our series of presentations for this session, but let me keep you for one more minute. There's a very interesting question posed to you. How would you analyze the support to the private sector?
Actually, we wanted to, because in fact, the Cameroon project was about strengthening the private sector. So in that case, we couldn't pursue the statistical analysis because through the scoreboard, we found out some potential problems. One problem was, for instance, the fact that there was not a selection of beneficiaries, private companies beneficiaries that were like in specific areas where higher is the incidence of poverty, or there could be some barriers, especially the issue of informal sector, as I said before, that it was difficult for them to access this program, and therefore, since informal sector in private sector is always the sector of the bottom 40 income population, maybe we cut out some. But in any case, we wanted to do the analysis, and precisely we wanted to check, first of all, the workers. So, because we saw that there was an increase in the labor force of the private sector that benefited from this program. So we wanted to see whether these labor forces increased thanks to this program, were belonging to the bottom 40 income population. That was the first step. The second, let's say, circle of analysis was the area, because you can, stimulate the demand, the trade into an area if the private sector works properly, and therefore you can, of course, create positive trade-off. And therefore we wanted to see whether the population, around the business were belonging to the bottom 40 or not. And we had plenty of idea, to see the turnover of the company or whether it goes. But I mean, you can add questions to these statistical tools, but it's absolutely feasible to look at the private sector. Actually, it should be. And you can look through this methodology to all type of programs, in my view, investment, for instance, infrastructure, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much for your answer. We'll have more in 5 minutes, and some of it with all of the presenters together. But now let us have a strictly 5-minute coffee break, if you don't mind. Please do not sign off. Just stay with us in the Zoom room, enjoy a short break, and we are ready to start with our discussants in 5 minutes. Thank you. See you soon.
From AFD, Agence Française de Développement, we want to tell you what the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities is, the projects we are carrying out, and our main research findings. The EU AFD Research Facility on Equalities is a programme funded by the European Commission and managed by AFD, aiming to improve knowledge and understanding of economic and social inequalities, their determinants and underlying mechanisms at different spatial levels, as well as the most effective policies and approaches to reduce them. With a budget of €4 million for the period 2017 to 2020 and a steering committee comprised of the European Commission, AFD and AECID, the Spanish cooperation, the programme launched more than 20 research projects in over 20 countries. This facility also aimed to engage in a joint reflection with Member States on ways to strengthen the contribution of EU development cooperation to the fight against inequalities in the framework of the implementation of Agenda 2030 and to contribute to EU development policy whose overarching objective is the eradication of poverty. The objectives of this facility are achieved through a three-pronged strategy. 1. Conducting research on the determinants and dynamics of economic and social inequalities in developing countries. 2. Targeting our work in partner countries that have expressed an interest or need. 3. Support partner countries and development institutions to integrate research findings into national policies and development cooperation strategies. Did you know that the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequality has produced over 100 research papers and policy briefs? All these articles analyse the links between inequalities and a wide array of topics such as education, health, labour markets, housing, taxation and climate change. These research publications, the support of the structuring and the strengthening of research networks on the topic of inequalities, further supports policymakers and development in mainstreaming and tackling the reduction of inequalities in their policies and strategies. However, the main point we would like to share with you is that we have observed how generalised are the effects of inequalities for societies, how unequal access to public services lowers the willingness to pay taxes, how unequal access to stable jobs creates poverty traps and exclusion, and how inequality shapes perceptions and the willingness to cooperate. So, how can we help strategies to reduce inequality? Through the development of new tools such as the inequality diagnostics, and the expansion of existing tools such as the fiscal incidence analysis and the multidimensional inequality framework, the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities supported the governments in partner countries and the civil society in building evidence-based strategies to reduce inequality. All these results have been presented at conferences, such as the 2018 International Conference on Inequalities and Social Cohesion, in national workshops and stakeholders events, such as those organised in Bolivia, Mexico, Tunisia and South Africa, in a series of webinars organised in 2020, and of course, in this final conference. In this final conference, beyond the presentation of all the results of the facility, there will be an opportunity to launch a second phase of reflections and partnerships that will be articulated in the extension of the facility over the period 2021 to 2026. We will be supporting 4 countries, Colombia, Indonesia, Mexico and South Africa, to design and implement policies to reduce inequalities. Will you join our goal to reduce these inequalities? Help us share the knowledge on reducing inequalities.
Good afternoon, if it is, to all of you. Good to have you all back for reflections from our two discussants coming up now. And don't forget, we're going to have a vivid Q&A after the discussants' input this afternoon. I would like to first thank Mr. Philippe Galland for being here with us. Before I start asking questions, let me introduce him shortly too. At AFD, Mr. Galland has started as a sustainable development analyst, assessing all AFD lending operations and grants according to 6 dimensions of sustainable development, as well as ensuring compliance with environmental and social safeguards. He has participated in decision meetings as a reviewer and has prepared material on the sustainable development impact of the operation for the board members. Today, Mr. Galland is the deputy head of Division 100% Social Link. His tasks include development and implementation of the new strategy within the group AFD, designing operational support in terms of inequality and inclusion, setting up new partnerships, and providing guidance and methodological tools in the area of inequality and inclusion. Let me give the floor over to our discussant now.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Let me say first that it's very good to see a team of researchers to take the time to study and to propose operational tools and solutions to address inequalities. That is very, very impressive, especially for us. When I say us, I speak about all the teams which are in the field and which are part of the executive department and are on day-to-day trying to address the inequality. So thanks very much for all the solutions and the tools you have designed for that. So as you know, we have now at the AFD a social link division. You may ask yourself what social link means and what is the relationship between social links and inequalities. So at AFD, we have defined a new cross-cutting strategy named the 100% social link, alongside with our 100% climate commitment. It is therefore a new commitment strategy which aims to accelerate the implementation of sustainable goals, sustainable development goals, the Paris Agreement, and the protection of common goods. This strategic commitment aims to increase the well-being of the population and the resilience of our societies. Concretely, the strategy will support the operational divisions to reduce multidimensional inequality, improve access to essential goods and services, and promote the social economic integration of population and territories while developing participatory modes of governance. This 100% social link strategy is a result of a long process led by the research teams, the executive and the strategy departments, involving regional directions and AFD representative agencies and field officers. Having said that, there are advantages. What are the advantages for the executive and operational departments where I belong to using the tools which has been presented during these sessions? I'd say Mr. Lebrand is the beginning of the story. And as part of the executive department, we have to find a way to use the tools and to see how far we can go with them. First, we have a common target. We have submitted a few weeks ago a new target at the AFD, the bottom 40. This is a very important step forward for us because it will give us the means to define the thresholds on inequalities, where we stand, and to design the future steps to ensure that our programs are more oriented towards the people in need. Second is the geographical appropriateness. As an operational agency of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we focus our operation in countries where support is needed, mainly in Africa, but not only. Methods and tools can use and be adapted in various contexts of interventions. I must say, as one of the speakers said, that the key success today is to include national authorities, national agencies, and civil societies during the first diagnosis. This is a very key element and sustainable approach, which will ensure a cooperative and positive dialogue with the authorities on inequality. Then at least the correlation with donors' financial instruments. The tools you have presented today are the great opportunity to foster fight against inequality. That is maybe very interesting for us at the executive department, is that there is a clear correlation between them and the donor financial instruments. The fiscal incidence analysis is a great support during our lending public policy, as what we call prêt politique publique, to analyze if a state budget, state policy that AFD could support is effective or oriented to poverty reduction. This could help us to ensure a positive dialogue with states on inequalities and propose crucial adjustments or accounting adjustments in the public policy matrix. The diagnostic tools which was presented, the inequality diagnosis tools or the tools used by Oxfam are essential as well to define our regional and national strategy and where grants actually should be prioritized. Concerning the loans, diagnostic results could give us a clear picture for states of the existing situation on inequalities with statistic and multidimensional approach and identify sectorial loans that could be good to tackle inequalities. So the combination of the tools results give a clear picture for states, for ministries at the ministry levels, and for international donors to agree on a joint and scientific analysis, and therefore the possibility to support state policy and commitments on a long-term perspective for more social justice and less poverty. Now I have got few questions as part of the executive department, and maybe I open the debate. The first is about the ownership, as you mentioned, and that is very important. Tools can be somehow adapted and adjusted according to context, and how we can present them to states in order that they can be better appropriate. This is the first question. How much? How long? Because for the executive department, you know, it is essential. The life cycle of a project is very short. Sometimes it's less than a year. So how the tools can be adapted to these constraints. Thank you so much. And I hope we'll have a good debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Galland. Now our final and last speaker, or rather discussant, is Mr. Udo Bullmann, member of the European Parliament, who will now reflect on the results and recommendations presented in this session and will elaborate a bit on the use of such tools in policymaking and development cooperation. So let me first introduce really shortly Mr. Bullmann. He was elected as a member of the European Parliament in 1999, where he joined the parliamentary group then called Group of the Party of European Socialists. Mr. Bullmann has been serving on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee and has been a rapporteur for a number of legislative and non-legislative files. From 2012 to 2017, for me to highlight just one aspect of his career, he's led the German SPD delegation in the S&D group until his election as the first vice president of the S&D group. He's a political scientist by training. Good to have you with us, sir.
Hello, everybody, and thanks, Christina, for inviting me to this inspiring session. I took a lot of profit by listening to all our experts, I have to admit. Let me explain that I'm totally convinced now that the work on inequalities is a well-established concept amongst our researchers. So I saw the tradition, I saw the new inspiring experiments to structure the issue, to tackle the problem. So that is really, it's great to be here. As a politician, as a political scientist, I'm delighted. As a politician, I have to question myself, is the same already true for policymakers? Do we have a well-established concept on the agenda when it comes to designing development policies, trade, technology transfer, etc., etc.? I have some doubts. I have to praise the fact that the Commission now turned to establish a special advisor on inequality, and I thank the Commissioner for that. Jutta Opelainen is, I think, convinced to promote the agenda. And of course, I have to praise the AFD for all the initiatives here and for putting a focus on the fight against inequality. But look at a national agenda. There is a lot of work to be done to convince national policymakers. Look at the mainstream at the European Union. Or, for instance, take the example of a traditional promotional bank. Not to speak about the private sector. A traditional promotional banker would say, well, I'm here to organize growth, whatever kind of. And if you start to discuss about the SDGs, then he would say, well, the Green Deal, okay, a bit for the Green Deal as well. No, you say, it's not about the Green Deal, it's about the Sustainable Development Strategy. It's about the Agenda 2030, and the Green Deal is only one element of it. It's also about social inclusion. It's about the promotion of health and for education and human development. Then he would say, come on, this is going to get a bit too complex for me. What do you want? And here we are. So the first thing we have to do is to establish the concept of the fight against inequality as a top priority in the political agenda of major policymakers. Why? You detect the strategic function of the fight against inequality if you look at the whole set of SDGs. The SDGs, unlike the predecessor concept, has the idea that everybody is in a developing country, the North as well as the South, and it needs horizontal initiatives. But at the end of the day, the concept of a sustainable society can only work out well if citizens, the members of the society, are going to become the co-producers of the new agenda, if they have ownership, if they can establish a collective identity of where to go to. And this is much easier if you enable people, if you empower people in the frame of an equal society. And that is underlining the strategic function of fighting inequalities as a major tool for achieving the whole set of where we would like to go. So this is my general idea. We have to fight for this agenda because it's key to set up a new development policy, a new technological transfer policy, a new idea of our social and economic model of development.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman, for contemplating how it may be ensured that inequality becomes and remains a top item on the agenda of policymakers and development institutions. But let me go a little deeper with you. Various tools which could support the mainstreaming of inequality, were presented in this session that you took part of all the time, all the session. Based on your experience as a politician, could you please reflect on how efficient do you think these tools will be, both for policymakers and for development institutions?
Well, I think we have to, it's a twofold exercise for me. First of all, we have to establish the principle, the general clause, the general idea, the general approach of how to spend our money, of how to redefine our legal framework, of how to use all our capacities to turn from a vicious circle into a virtuous circle of communication between the North and the South. So this is the key idea. Once you have established this as a general approach, the main general approach, then it's about fine-tuning. And when it comes to the concrete budget support programs, when it comes to the multi-annual indicative programs, then we need, and all the experts have already elaborated on that, we need two things. We need local ownership, because civil society plays a major role. Our people on the ground play a major role, otherwise we cannot deliver. It's not a top-down thing. It's a collective bottom-up issue that we are talking about within a general frame. Within a redefined general frame, it's going to become a bottom-up issue. And the bottom-up issue needs both things. It needs ownership. People have to commit themselves. We need empowerment of the people, and we need flexibility. Because as one of our experts put it, we have to check out who is left behind and for what reason. And how can we change a situation within the relative specificities? Sometimes it's more gender, sometimes it's urban rural, sometimes it's most of the time it's poor and rich on the other hand. But the whole polarization in an unequal society has to be captured in the picture of how to introduce your local initiatives, your regional renewed programs, and your national setup.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bowman. And if you don't mind, I'd like to open the floor up to all of the other presenters and speakers and engage them and give them the floor to ask you questions as well. And I would like to ask you to stay with us. And if you feel ready, answer some of the questions that we have from the audience to all of the panelists and presenters and discussants. Let me ask now, I see everyone with us, if you can, or if you may, or if you would like to engage Mr. Bowman as well on some of the questions. He's both a political scientist and a politician. And let me first start the conversation with a question to everyone, to all speakers. Can these tools that you've been explaining be applied to improve the targeting of public investment projects vis-a-vis the bottom 40%, blending operations, or are there IFIs that have similar methodologies? I guess this should be Mr. Morabito answering first. I think he used the 40% the most.
I will do it. Certainly, yes. Actually, it has been designed for this not the specific purpose of increasing the effectiveness of the public investment, because we look mainly at the the work of development cooperation agencies and programs. But still remember that any program done by a development cooperation is in line with a government program. And if it looks, for instance, I'm thinking at public works, like infrastructure, for instance, that could be a fundamental tool to check precisely the direction of this investment. I mean, just a brief parenthesis. We know by fact that, for instance, rural roads and electrification, that's a major public investment in general, or public-private. In any case, it's an investment. Reduce inequalities. That's empirical demonstrated. Still, we can have other investment that supposedly do so, like cabling with internet, some areas or stuff like that. Because I think we're talking about this type of investments, that they're done through parallel agencies, development agencies. Well, in this respect, you might ask yourself, as I said before, to whom is going to benefit most. And these tools can tell you since the beginning and the design of it, to whom is going to benefit most, to who's the people are going to use most this, in which area you're going to do that. You know, all these kind of questions you can reply through this tool. I'm now talking about, you know, also the others. I think it's a collective thinking, in my view. That's are essential precisely to check whether they will disproportionately impact the bottom 40 or not.
Thank you. May I ask the other participants if they would chip in? I think Mr. Lebrant is changing on mute.
Yeah, I'd like to come in and just extend that, you know, and so when Christian was talking, he was talking a lot about in a spatial sense, like where are the pockets of the most vulnerable? And I think that one of the links precisely to this public investment issue is most public investment strategies are not macroeconomic. They're actually supporting a development bank or supporting some municipal or local issues. And I think there's immense ability in these tools to help profile what are the vulnerabilities at the local level. So in our case, all of the work that we did on spatial inequalities, there's a lot of detail there that can be drawn on to profile regions, and that meshes in the South African context and probably in other contexts too. It meshes greatly with the AFD's focus on supporting municipal infrastructure. It's not just infrastructure in general, it's supporting local districts, because that's where people live, right? People live somewhere in a particular space, and the investments take place into particular spaces, and they're targeted into particular spaces. And so you need to hone that local level context, and its detail is very, very important to the return on the investment, to use that sort of crash language. But what is a return on investment? Return on investment is empowering people's livelihoods where they live, in the circumstances that they live. And there's a very good meshing of these tools with that. So that was my input on that. Would you allow me, Christina, a comment in general on Mr. Bullman's statement, really, really profound, actually, statement about changing the narrative and the strategy, making people think about not just us, who are the converted already, about the usefulness of an inequality framework. I just wanted to add the point that, because of course this is the language that the World Economic Forum talks about, the G20 talks about this, about social cohesion and the necessity for societies to have a social compact, and but it comes home to roost when people like Mr. Bullman, and when you're talking to countries and you're saying, look, this is the way sustainable development happens. There's a necessity to be missionary about it, to really believe that this is the way to go, and the way you interact with local officials. In other words, I'm endorsing what you're saying, but saying that this panel represents a lot of progress in pushing on. But now it's quite important that that we take that into our engagements, you know, and so in my experience in South Africa, I have a lot of resonance with this, because this is where the society knows that this is how we're constrained. In Ghana and in Kenya, it's not quite the same thing, and there's a lot of need to take this message that this is the approach into that space. I just thought it was a really useful insight, but I think that the road forward is quite clear, that we need to be very articulate in taking that forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me take the opportunity to hand it back to Mr. Bullman.
Thanks very much for this comment. Yes, I agree. And sometimes I cannot deny the political analyst. So, and I see there is a certain gap between the language and the headlines. They become better and better, and the implementation of our policies. And here we have a hell of a way in front of us. And of course, our endeavor has to be to enhance the road and to speed up the road to sustainable strategies. The very question from Christina was also about investments, and it was about blended finances. And a quick comment on that, perhaps also. Our data, our experience so far tell us that it doesn't work the poorer the countries are. In LDCs, it's much more complicated to have a successful strategy using blended finances because the urgent need is the public good. So the urgent need is health, is education, and human development. We have to start with that always, and we should never lose it as our focus point. And if you go to private investment, which you need, of course, you need, then we should take on board some experiences we did in different regions and areas. I remember very well last mandate when Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission's president, took up what we wanted to have in this mandate, a big investment program, what he thought would be work out in the FC, so-called FC structure. Popular name was Juncker Fund. Juncker Fund number one, Juncker Fund number two. I was leading the legislation for the European Parliament on both. And I can only tell you that the more intermediate actors you have, the more you also have to deal with institutional conservatism. That is especially true for promotional banks. They do what they ever did because they know best, whereas politicians know nothing about their business. So what you really need, this is their anticipation of the situation. But what you need here is a strong framing exercise by legislation, and you need tough scrutiny, and you need a debate about governance culture. At the very end of setting up this fund for the European Union domestic policy issues, we ended up to set one institutional expert on behalf of the Parliament in the supervisory entity of this new fund, because we needed to have transparency and we needed to have a grip on the practical implementation. It is not enough to listen twice a year to some report from somebody. So this is nothing. You need to have a grip on what is going on, and you need to change the rules of the game. And that sometimes you can only do from the inside. So I'm not only talking about the EIB, but I wouldn't neglect that I'm also talking about the EIB.
Thank you so much. Let me use the remaining time that we have for one of the very, very interesting and important questions asked to all of you. Let me start with Ms. Anda David answering. What tools do you think would be critical to make available at the local level? How could local and regional governments be empowered to take ownership of these tools? Ms. David?
It's a very interesting question, and indeed it's something that that we came across also in the first exercises. So I'm just going to take the example of the South African diagnostic, because I've worked intensively on it with Murray. And what is interesting to notice is that one of the first reactions from StatSA, so from the National Statistical Office, when working on that diagnostic was, okay, once we finish this, we need to then do a sort of road trip across each province and discuss with the provincial governments on how do they see the reality reflected in the diagnostic and how we can work further. And that's quite important, because what we see is that inequality is very often a spatial issue. We have cringing spatial inequalities all over the world and in each country. And in order to go towards reducing those kind of inequalities, we need to improve the ownership of the tools by, as you say, the local government, but also try to reinforce the capacities of local government in terms of data production, in terms of data analysis, etc. And having this push towards trying at least to compute most of the indicators at different spatial levels could be a first step, because it allows us to have a clear understanding of the local realities of inequalities, but not just inequalities. So the mapping of inequalities, as we have started to do with the African Center of Excellence for Inequalities Research, is a good step forward. It would also be interesting, for instance, to run the fiscal incidence analysis on provincial or municipal budgets. I'm not sure we have the data to do so, but it could also be a way forward.
Thank you so much. Let me turn over now to Ms. Anna Claver from Oxfam.
Well, thanks so much. Just 2 words I would say. I totally agree with what Anda just said about supporting local authorities and and different actors to strengthen their ability and capacity to use these tools. But I would like to say also that there are already many local actors who are already empowered and who are using their own tools, their own understanding, and their own, claims on inequalities. And maybe our mission is as well to, use these tools, for example, in the case of the multidimensional inequality framework, use it in a very flexible way, trying to build on the previous work that different actors have done and are already doing.
Mr. Lebrun?
No, I think you should give Jon a turn. I'll pass.
Okay, you were just nodding that I thought that you had some really strong comments. I have a bunch of questions to Mr. Jalema, specifically, besides being interested in what he has to say about all that we've been talking about, because he hasn't had a chance to take back the floor yet. But let me add 2 questions to that, if you don't mind, Jon. How do you see, as a practitioner, a seasoned practitioner of methodological innovations, all of the tools and methodologies presented here today and their use? And could you maybe elaborate why the effects of the same fiscal policy have such drastically opposite effect on poverty in different African countries? How can this be translated into recommendations for the policymakers? These were 2 important questions bunched in one, to give the floor to you as one of the last commentators today. And we're, of course, interested in all the rest of what you have to say about previous comments.
Thank you kindly for giving me place of privilege here at the last for some concluding words. The questions that you asked are also pertinent and allow me to come back to a favorite topic of mine, which we haven't focused on during this discussion, which is absolutely fine, but which is equally relevant, I think, for all of the issues that we're discussing, and particularly these ones that are coming up at the end. And after having listened to Mr. Bullman and Christian also, and all of the other presenters, that we haven't explicitly mentioned revenue collections and the revenue side of the fiscal ledger, and what revenue policy in particular means, both for the impact of policies on inequality and poverty, and that speaks specifically to the drastic contrast in results among different African countries, but also in all other regions of the world with respect to fiscal policies' impact on poverty. The reason behind it is the different revenue collection policies that there are and who they create burdens for. That's an empirical result that we can discuss in great detail and by type of tax or type of revenue collection instrument. But I think there's also an issue that speaks directly to local ownership. So there's a desire on all of our parts, and I think also for local actors as well to better understand and use more effectively all of these tools, but also to realize that the development plans, be they locally generated, be they nationally generated, be they generated in international fora, and sustainable development planning also in some sense depends on or creates public goods that in the best case scenario, we would all want to be funded domestically. In other words, the public goods which are being created through these investments in education and health, in clean water, in roads and ports and so on and so forth, that we would want them to be funded by the very people, the very same individuals for whom they create public goods. And in a lot of cases, MFIs, IFIs, donor agencies have great ideas for investments, but those investments will outlast the funding cycle within the MFI, within the IFI. And in the best case scenario, we'd like the local counterparts to agree that the investment in the education system, in clean water, were good ones, and see the wisdom of the investment and see the inequality reducing impacts and so on and so forth, and therefore say, among themselves, we agree that going forward, the positive impacts from this investment are something that we would like to donate our own hard-earned income towards. And the most efficient way for that to happen is for everybody to agree also on the revenue collection framework and agree that it's not creating inequalities where there shouldn't be inequalities, that the poor shouldn't contribute more than their fair share of revenues which fund public investments, as well as security services and law and order and all of the other things that governments do. So I think I've answered most of the salient points that you raised, or the salient questions that you raised, through this focus on the revenue side of things, which we've not spoken too much about today, which is okay, but I want to make sure it remains in the back of our minds, and also going forward, that we are equally aware of what revenue collection and revenue policy can do in terms of fostering local ownership of development strategies and growth frameworks and so on and so forth.
Thank you for bringing it up, for bringing it into the conversation before we wrap up. And before we do wrap up, I'd like to give the chance to anyone who would like to comment one more time before we finish the session. Any chance for last remarks or a reaction? Seeing all your smiling and ready faces, thank you really much. It was very, very insightful, important. Congratulations on all of your work, which you'll have to keep up. And thanks for the audience for the smart and important questions. And we would like to see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock and at 3 p.m. Of course, we'll start tomorrow morning by very specific testimonials on the country projects. It's really important. And then see you at 3 tomorrow afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Have a nice afternoon or whatever you have now. Goodbye.